Chapter 5. The protagonist careened down the streets and alleys of the city, sinking further and further into despair. As he stumbled through dark, serpentine corridors, he passed innumerable faceless men, clad in drab, indistinguishable raincoats with turned-up collars and wide-brimmed hats, hurrying along on unknowable missions. The protagonist's dream had left him feeling desolate and helpless. At every intersection he turned again and again in an attempt to find room to be alone with his thoughts. But after each turn, he was confronted by further meandering sidewalks, packed with more faceless men trudging past him without recognition or acknowledgement. Their constant presence only increased his sense of isolation. Above the street, darkened, unfriendly windows surrounded him, and the billboards were all leering. The world grew narrow and unfamiliar, as if a fog had settled in. Soon he was lost in the maze of twisted and misshapen streets that comprised the oldest part of the great city. The crisp sound of a church bell rang out from an unseen tower. Flakes of snow became visible as they descended in the beams of the streetlights. The protagonist followed the sound of the bell, walking in the gutter to avoid the crush of pedestrians rushing along on the sidewalk. The pavement was soon dusted with a thin layer of white slush that soaked and stained his shoes. The bell rang out again, then a third time, seemingly closer with each peal. Since the protagonist did not know his current location, he couldn't say if he was approaching the bell tower or if the bell tower was approaching him. But he began to feel that their trajectories were destined to intersect. He pushed his hat forward to shield his eyes from the falling snow, which left the nape of his neck vulnerable to the icy sting of snowflakes. With his vision obscured, he could no longer see the path ahead of him clearly, but he pressed forward, staring at his own feet, trusting passerbys to notice him and step out of the way. Suddenly, the street noise surrounding him died down, as if a radio playing only static had been unplugged. It was silent as the grave. He stopped and looked up. He was in the middle of a now deserted block, standing in front of a Gothic-styled cathedral. The faceless men in their drab raincoats had all disappeared from the streets. No cars passed by. Even the snow had stopped falling. From just above him, the church bell rang out one final time. He was here. The building was ancient. The stones that made up the cathedral's edifice were blackened with soot from decades of exposure to the bustling city. Small drifts of white snow had nestled into the crevices, slowly melting and dripping water down the walls and buttresses. At the top of a short set of steps were two thick wooden doors, propped slightly open despite the weather. A flickering of lights from inside drizzled into the street. The stones above the door had been carved with the name Cathedral of St. Ovidius by some stone carver, no doubt long dead. Affixed to one door was a vinyl sign that flapped in the wind like a beckoning arm. It read, "Midnight Mass. All are welcome." The protagonist felt a sudden desire to be somewhere where all are welcomed, so he climbed the steps and entered the church. The small foyer directly beyond the thick wooden doors held nothing but a display of pamphlets, some children's drawings of misshapen angels rendered in blue crayon, and a box soliciting donations for renovations. A corkboard hung above the box, entirely empty save for several pushpins and a small banner that read, "Community Announcements." The floor here was mostly scuffed linoleum, but in a few places it had worn through sufficiently to expose the ancient hardwood floor that lay underneath. A nondescript door in the foyer was closed with a paper sign reading, "No admittance," tacked to it with a pushpin. The protagonist tried the knob anyway, but it was locked. Directly across from that door was an open archway, and the protagonist stepped through. As he entered the nave, he reached towards the font, but the basin was dry and empty. A few parishioners sat in the pews, mostly alone, but sometimes in groups of 2 or 3. Some stared straight ahead blankly. Others had their faces buried in prayer books. One elderly woman was rocking back and forth ferociously. No one was speaking. Against the wall was a table on which had been placed a large number of burning candles. The protagonist picked up a fresh candle and moved to light it, but couldn't think of a single person he knew well enough to say a prayer for. He stood awkwardly for a time, and then sheepishly replaced the candle back down and sat himself in one of the pews. "Terrible weather tonight, isn't it?" he greeted the person sitting closest to him in a hushed tone. The parishioner made no acknowledgement and gave no response, instead remaining focused on his reading. The protagonist then turned around and caught the eye of a young woman sitting a few rows behind him. He waved and said hello, a little louder this time. The young woman responded only by tapping the side of her head, which the protagonist inferred to be a signal that she could not hear him clearly. He turned back around, feeling slightly dejected. As he scanned the rest of the room, it seemed that the parishioners each existed in their own independent bubble, electing to spend their evening interacting with the divine, as opposed to interacting with the other mortals who had joined them for the service. He became impatient with the silence, and, out of boredom, reached for the hymnal stored in a pocket in the pew in front of him. When he pulled out the book, several pamphlets fell to the ground. One advertised a support group for alcoholics. It featured a photograph of a crowd of smiling people of all ages and ethnicities, toasting each other with cups of steaming black tea. They looked very happy in their shared sobriety. A second advertised a meeting for those who had experienced a recent tragedy to commiserate over their shared grief. It featured a photograph of a crying woman being hugged by another person and had the words, "You are not alone," written at the top. A third pamphlet advertised a cooking class for diabetics. It featured a photograph of the festival table filled with innumerable healthy delicacies prepared for a large holiday gathering. The protagonist mused that it was unfortunate he suffered no malady or misfortune sufficient enough to make him eligible to attend the groups. The silence was broken by the sound of a door opening on the chancel. An enrobed priest entered. As he walked slowly and wordlessly to the pulpit, the heads of the parishioners turned, one by one, to face him. The priest quietly laid some papers on the lectern and spread them out. The protagonist was hopeful that he would receive some words of comfort from whatever sermon the priest had planned, or at least be distracted by some new idea or thought to help shake the terrible dream of war that was still at the forefront of his mind. The priest's words gave no comfort, though, as the sermon was not in a language the protagonist understood. It was an old language, guttural yet lyrical in tone, but wholly unfamiliar to the protagonist's ears. It wasn't Latin or Greek, he was sure of that, but something else. Coptic, perhaps? Whatever it was, the faithful were rapt with attention. Every face stared directly at the priest as he delivered the liturgy. Since the words meant nothing to the protagonist's ears, he soon became disinterested, but he could see that every other person in attendance was utterly mesmerized by the priest's performance. Several wept openly. Whatever comfort the protagonist had vainly hoped to receive, the other parishioners were clearly receiving it. Oddly, they remained silent. There was not a hallelujah or an amen from a single person in the pews. The priest spoke at length, pausing now and again to turn the pages of the notes in front of him. Through most of the sermon, his tone was flat and emotionless, but as he progressed, he began to speak louder and with a rising crescendo of passion. When he finally reached his conclusion, he raised his arms up in the air. At this signal, the faithful all stood and raised their arms in unison. Out of courtesy, the protagonist similarly stood and raised his arms, although he did not know what he was standing for. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Everyone lowered their hands and sat back down. The priest wordlessly picked up his notes and left through the same door from which he came. The clatter of his heels on the marble was the only sound. After the chancel door closed, The parishioners stood up and began milling about quietly. They placed their hymnals back in their pews. The young woman the protagonist had attempted to speak to earlier walked to the front of the church and knelt directly before the dais to say her personal prayer. The protagonist remained at a respectful distance, but after she had finished, he walked up to her and again said, "Terrible weather tonight, isn't it?" But she passed him without acknowledgement. It was then that he noticed that the young woman had no ears. She was completely deaf. The protagonist looked closely at the other parishioners and noticed the same thing. No one was speaking, but a few made gestures with their arms that could have been a form of sign language. The parishioners silently exited, one by one, through a door at the back of the church that led to an adjacent dining hall. The protagonist followed. The hall was mostly bare and unadorned. One of the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly. A disused piano, half covered in a tarp, had been pushed off to one side. A pile of filthy children's toys had been heaped haphazardly in a corner next to an empty bookcase and a stained and threadbare couch. Some folding tables and chairs leaned against one wall. In the middle of the room, a giant table, covered by several paper tablecloths, had been set with all sorts of food. Mismatched trays and bowls contained overly cooked vegetables and casseroles and misshapen loaves of homemade bread. Several earnestly decorated but lopsided cakes waited patiently to be consumed. The centerpiece of the table was a glistening ham the size of a large baby. The parishioners gathered and sat and ate and spoke to each other with their hands. The protagonist stood aloof, off to the side, observing, but not participating. He wondered what they spoke of. Was it the quality of the meal? Was it the general comings and goings of their daily lives? Was it the sermon that they had just experienced? Without a common language, he had no way of knowing. They ate roughly, ripping and tearing the meats and bread with their bare hands. As they dined and socialized, no one approached the protagonist or invited him to sit, but they also didn't actively glare at him or do anything to make him feel uncomfortable. For a few moments, the protagonist considered joining the table, but he was too intimidated to intrude on a large group of strangers. Besides, he told himself, he did not have much of an appetite. In the end, he took only a small crust of bread, and he only did so to assure himself that he was actually physically present and not just some sort of incorporeal ghost. The bread was warm and fresh, but tasteless in his mouth. After lingering for a few minutes, he poured himself a cup of coffee from a large urn and left. No one was looking directly at him to see him wave on his way out. The heat of the beverage burned his fingers through the thin paper cup. He left the church through the foyer and the thick wooden doors that led back onto the street. The pavement had dried and the sky was clear and full of stars, although an icy chill remained in the air. The protagonist sat on the steps to drink his coffee and ponder his next destination. "Weather's improving tonight, isn't it?" said a voice from behind him. The protagonist turned to see the priest walking out into the frigid night air. "I thought it was going to rain all night, didn't you?" he continued. The priest had changed out of his formal raiments into a comfortable gray tracksuit covered by a threadbare woolen coat and a long knitted scarf. As he approached, he unscrewed the cap on a metal flask. He sat down on the steps beside the protagonist and took a swig. A city bus without a single passenger inside drove past, kicking up some leaves that had fallen into the gutter. "We don't get many walk-ins," the priest said, "especially for the late service." "I guess I was feeling a bit lost and cold," replied the protagonist. "I wouldn't have intruded if I'd realized you'd catered to such a specialized clientele." "All are welcome. Of course, most folks are inclined to socialize with their own tribe, and people like you are far and few." "People like me?" the priest responded. "Those without a tribe." He handed the protagonist the flask. The liquid inside was cheap rotgut, and it burned his tongue as it went down. Am I that obvious? In my line of work, you can spot the signs of somebody who's been abandoned. The priest took another draught from the flask. Can I ask if you got any comfort from being here tonight? Not really, but I've grown used to that. They sat in silence for a while, trading the flask back and forth. Can I ask you a question? Said the protagonist. I was wondering what language you were speaking when you were giving the sermon. Oh, that, laughed the priest. It's the policy of our diocese that all sermons must be in something called Adamic. It's a very old language. In fact, it's the oldest language. Every other language, every single language from all around the world can ultimately trace its lineage back to primordial Adamic. They say it dates from before our ancestors first stood on two legs and migrated out of Africa, before God cast down the Tower of Babel, back to a time when all of mankind spoke the same tongue. And if you believe certain apocryphal scriptures, it goes back even further than that, and was the celestial tongue of the gods themselves before humans ever walked the earth. The idea of using it for our sermons is that it's more accurate because it's the only language unadulterated by mankind's bias. Was it hard to learn? Asked the protagonist. Well, I'd imagine so. Of course, I don't know a single person who can actually speak it. I sure don't. How do you give a sermon in a language you don't speak? Well, not as hard as you'd think, actually. Every week a packet comes to me by mail from headquarters. It's got an entire sermon written for me, word for word. I haven't the foggiest notion of what it means. They don't bother including a translation. But oddly, there's a lot of pronunciation notes included, so I just read it phonetically. I've been told that it's critically important to get the pronunciation exactly right. Sometimes the archbishop will send an evaluator to sit in the back and critique my oration. That's who I assumed you were at first. Seems like an odd aesthetic choice, replied the protagonist. I mean, if you don't know what you're saying and the people listening don't know what they're being told, how can you be providing them with hope and comfort? I've come to learn that when people crave hope and comfort, it's never about what specific words or facts someone tells them. It's about the emotions that stir inside them when they hear it. None of my flock can understand the language, sure, but none of them can hear a word of any language anyway. And yet that doesn't seem to matter. They come every week. Let me ask you a question. Do you happen to know how they tune an orchestra? The priest asked. Not really, replied the protagonist. The musicians all take their seats, and then the oboe plays a long, unbroken A note. Every instrument in the orchestra has an A, so the musicians all match their note to the oboe's. That way everyone's tuned the same. It doesn't really matter if the oboe itself is a bit out of tune. As long as everybody is a bit out of tune the same way, the aggregate melody sounds good. That's me. I'm the oboe. People come here to tune themselves to my A note. I think I must be tone deaf then, joked the protagonist. I never feel like I'm in tune with anybody else's melody. The hardest problem in the world to cure is loneliness, said the priest. It's the only problem a person can have where they can't turn to others for comfort. The pair continued to trade the flask back and forth for a few minutes. After a while, the protagonist said, Can I confess something? It's not just other people I can't seem to connect with. I don't ever feel a connection to the divine. I never have. Maybe it's just too abstract for me to perceive, but I close my eyes and there's nothing. I say a prayer and it floats out into the void. Not even an echo comes back. It's like talking to a phone that's been disconnected. Honestly, I suspect that maybe everyone feels that way most of the time. On the inside, at least, responded the priest. That's why my flock pays to have someone like me point the divine out to them in an imperious stone building filled with overbearing symbolism. And even with my help, most people are lucky if they can just catch a glimpse of it for a few fleeting moments before it's gone again. I suspect that those few who claim to regularly feel that connection are lying to themselves. Or just insane. Happy and content, maybe, but insane. Or on drugs. Different folks, different strokes, whatever works for you. Who am I to judge? He took a deep swig and finished off what was left in the flask. What do I know? I just work here. The protagonist didn't respond, but wondered if that was a confession that the priest was just as lost as alone as he was. He took a sip of the coffee he had poured himself earlier, but it had turned cold in the night air and was acrid and bitter. He spilled it out onto the stone. Brown rivulets cascaded down the steps like a tiny waterfall. The street was quiet, but the scuffling of feet and the clattering of cutlery could still be faintly heard from inside. "Can I admit something to you?" said the priest. "I think that we're all living in a timeline abandoned by God. Have you ever heard of the multi-worlds theory?" "No, but from the name I can probably guess what it's about." "Okay, so say I flip a coin and it's heads. Then, all of a sudden, bam, there's now a duplicate universe, exactly the same as this one in every way, but where the coin landed tails. And then that tiny divergence starts our world and the other world on different paths. And this happens again and again, every single time a person anywhere flips a coin, or when someone like you decides whether or not to wander into a random church in the middle of the night, or even every single time some molecule somewhere in the universe zigs instead of zags. Infinite branching over and over again, a whole infinity of universes." The protagonist responded, "I was just thinking about how big the world was when I was sitting in a park earlier. I concluded that its vastness was just too enormous for me to grasp, and that was just one universe." "Right," said the priest. "The concept is mind-bogglingly vast, isn't it?" He was clearly excited to talk to someone open to his theory. "I mean, it's hard enough to imagine keeping track of everything going on in one universe, or one whole planet even. There's no way anyone, even God, could possibly be paying attention to everything that is happening everywhere in an almost infinite number of universes." "I don't suppose anyone could." "And of course, just by chance, some of those universes are going to come out, I don't know, better than others by some standard. In a very select few, everything will just randomly end up pretty much perfect. I mean, that's just basic statistics, right? Well, don't you think that God is naturally going to spend his time on the few good ones, his few favorites, where everything is working out? I'm sure of it. I mean, who wouldn't, right? And so, what happens to all those other universes? The ones where things didn't work out so great, where things are falling into decline and people are hopelessly failing and evil exists and bad things happen to good folks for no reason. I'd imagine those versions get thrown into the trash. Forsaken. Exactly. They get tossed aside and forgotten about, but that doesn't mean they stop existing. That would be too kind. Haven't you had a nagging feeling that everything is just wrong somehow? It's because these worlds like ours, forgotten worlds, they just keep limping along, mortally wounded but not quite dead, ignored, prayers left unanswered, unjustly neglected in the grand design, like an unwanted infant tossed into a trash can and left to freeze. That's where I think we are. What do you think we did wrong? I don't think it had anything to do with us. We were just unlucky that the random fluctuations of the quantum wave function collapsed the wrong way in our universe. Maybe it was some coin flip that was heads when it should have been tails. Maybe it was some cesium atom that decayed when it shouldn't have. There's no way to ever know. That's a pretty depressing thought, said the protagonist. It is, isn't it? Said the priest. We don't deserve that. We don't deserve to be forgotten like that. I mean, well, most of us don't anyway. So, do you think that the end of the world is coming? The priest responded, It'd be easy to think it's the end of the world, but I believe there's still hope. I suspect that there's some fail-safe mechanism built into the system. What is that? Well, maybe it sounds crazy, but I think it's those heirloom. Have you noticed that as things keep getting worse and worse, those little beasts seem to be showing up more and more? Years ago, you could only see them if you were on drugs. But now everyone bumps into them lurking around all over the place, even in broad daylight. I think I saw a few in the park earlier, said the protagonist. The weird thing to me is that no one seems to think it's weird they just started showing up. No one bats an eye. Like, people had been expecting them to just be there, even before they arrived. Yeah. I feel that there's something that's been hard-coded into the design of the universe. I don't know what to call them. Maybe they're angels, maybe they're machine elves, maybe there's some autogenous repair system programmed into the DNA of the planet. I suspect they've been here since the beginning, but they normally stay dormant and invisible. Only once the universe gets off track and starts to decline do they come out of whatever hidden dimension they normally dwell in and start doing something. The protagonist was intrigued by the idea. Doing what? He asked. I can't say for certain, but it's pretty obvious that they're doing something. You can see that much, can't you? They move with purpose. After I close up the church each night, I spy on them from the bell tower and ponder what they could be working on. I think that they're building something. Building what? They're building a distress beacon, a hotline, I don't know, some kind of shortwave radio transmitter, but one that's directly connected to God. They're trying to get his attention, sending an SOS, trying to get God to remember that we're still here. What do you think they're going to tell him? Nothing. I don't think they can. All they can do is provide the connection. It's up to us to figure out how to make our case to get God's attention again. What would you say? What would you say to the parent that abandoned you to adoption years ago? What would you say to the beauty queen who laughed in your face when you asked them to prom? What would you say to the rich man on the street who won't look you in the eye when you try to guilt him into dropping a coin into your tin cup? What if we say the wrong thing? Asked the protagonist. Nothing, I'd think. Nothing happens at all. There wouldn't be any merciful end to the suffering. No, we'd just stay forgotten, and things keep limping along with no driver at the wheel, slowly getting worse and worse. That's not a very comforting thought, said the protagonist. Well, I'm off duty, the priest chuckled. If you want comforting, you'll have to come back for a sermon. I thought no one could understand your sermons. Exactly. You can just listen and let your mind make up whatever comforting thoughts you need to get through the day, just like the rest of us. The priest lifted the flask and attempted without success to drain another drop of liquor into his mouth. Oh well, I need to get back in there anyway before they break something. Have a good evening, son. And with that, the priest patted the protagonist on the back, rose to his feet, and went back inside the church. The protagonist turned his attention to the long rivulet of spilled coffee that had now dribbled down all the way to the sidewalk below. He was cold and uncomfortable from sitting on the stone steps, and he too rose to leave. As he straightened the wrinkles out of his overcoat, his gaze caught the eyes of the cathedral's anchorite, who'd been staring at him through a small gap between the stones of the church wall. Hey, buddy, come here, the anchorite said in a hoarse murmur. The protagonist went over to the opening and appeared inside. It was pitch black in the anchorite's chamber, but his eyes were wide and glowed a fierce white. He's right, you know, about everything. The heirloom told me themselves. They don't talk to him, but they talk to me. They told you. I didn't know they could talk at all, replied the protagonist. Not in real life. They sing to me in my dreams. Little machine elves flitting and flickering and telling me all sorts of things when they're in my dreams. What did they tell you? Asked the protagonist, more out of bemusement than curiosity. That they know I'm forgotten in here, but that I'm not alone because it's not just me who's forgotten. We're all of us, forgotten everywhere. The universe is infinite, but our world's lost and fallen down an oubliette. No one up there is coming to save us. No one up there in the higher dimensions even remembers we still exist. And we've been down here so long, we don't even remember anymore that there's anything up outside of our hole. But the Erlem, they naturally move in and out of those higher dimensions. They know things. They see things. They revealed to me how it could be different. Told me the plan for salvation. The priest said that we just had to get God's attention, plead our case for help. No, man, it's easier than that. We just wait until the Erlem build the beacon and we get God to see us. But when he comes by to take a closer look, we jump him and get the keys. Then we open the door. The door to where? To where? Man, it's the door to everywhere, screamed the anchorite. The door to any world we want to go to. I'm going to escape to a world where I'm not an anchorite. I'm the bishop of the whole damn cathedral. Or even better, the king, the pope, anything, man. Once I get through the door, all I got to do is murder whatever version of me lives in that better world and take his place. The anchorite was clearly insane, thought the protagonist. Are you worried that some version of you from an even worse place will have the same idea and try to take your place here? He asked. That's why I lock myself in here. Ain't no version of me anywhere is going to want to come to a world where they have to be an anchorite. I'm safe in here. Totally safe and forgotten till I'm ready to make my move. Well, good luck with that, said the protagonist, turning to leave. I hope you end up somewhere swell. Where are you going to go? Which version of you do you dream of? Shouted the anchorite as he walked away. The protagonist did not respond. And which version of you out there is dreaming about walking in your shoes?